Okay, listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you should make your blood run cold. Vladimir Putin has just looked the world straight in the eye and, with a dead serious face, delivered a message that boils down to this. If Ukraine and its allies don't give him what he wants, Russia will simply seize more territory by force, not just the territory Russia currently occupies more. As in, the war you might have hoped was drifting toward an ending. Putin is warning you it's only beginning unless the other side surrenders to his demands. This happened yesterday, December 17th, 2025, at Russia's annual defense ministry meeting. Putin stood there with his generals around him and gave what his propaganda machine is praising as a strategic assessment. But what it really was an ultimatum disguised in the polite clothing of diplomacy. And the most chilling part is that he's barely pretending anymore. He isn't even acting like he's negotiating in good faith. He's openly signaling that talks are simply a tool, a way to get what he wants without paying for it on the battlefield. And if he can't get it that way, then he'll take it the hard way anyway. This is what you could call Putin's strategic silence. Yes, he's talking. Sure, he's meeting with American envoys. He's sitting through marathon, 5-hour discussions with President Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff. But he isn't truly negotiating. He's waiting for the West to get tired, waiting for Ukraine to run short on ammunition, waiting for Trump to get impatient and push Kyiv into a rotten deal. Putin isn't silent because he's weighing options. He's silent because he's already decided. And what he's decided is that time is his ally. But before we dig into why this blend of fake negotiations and very real territorial demands is actually weakness masquerading as strength, let's make sure this analysis reaches every person who needs to hear it. If you believe in cutting through propaganda and seeing what's really happening in this war, hit subscribe right now. Press like the way you'd push back against disinformation. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Putin is counting on you not paying attention. He's counting on Western audiences getting bored, exhausted, distracted, and the best weapon we have against that strategy is information, cold, hard, fact-based analysis. So let's get to work. Start with what Putin said yesterday, because the wording matters. Speaking to his senior military brass, Putin declared that Russia has seized and firmly holds the strategic initiative along the entire front line. That's Kremlin language for, "We're winning." He claimed Russia liberated more than 300 settlements in 2025, and he praised the military for smashing Ukraine's elite units. It all sounds triumphant victory music, mission accomplished, until he pivots to what he actually cares about. What happens if peace talks don't hand him everything he demands? And then comes the line that should make every European capital sit bolt upright. Translated from Russian state media, Putin said, Russia would prefer to resolve this and eliminate the root causes of the conflict through diplomacy. But if the opposing country and its foreign patrons refuse substantive discussions, Russia will secure the liberation of its historical lands through military means. Let's unpack that, because every word is deliberate. First, notice the framing. Russia prefers diplomacy. Russia is the reasonable adult in the room. Russia wants to talk, but if Ukraine and its Western backers refuse substantive discussions, which in Putin's code means give us what we want, then Russia will supposedly have no choice but to take more land by force. This is classic abuser rhetoric. I didn't want to hurt you, but you made me do it by refusing my demands. Manipulation dressed up as practicality. And then there's the truly sinister phrase, historical lands. Not just what Russia occupies today, not just Crimea and the Donbass. Historical lands. That phrase is terrifying precisely because it's vague by design. What counts as historical to Putin? All of Ukraine, parts of Poland, the Baltic states. Where does that imperial nostalgia stop? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky understood the danger immediately, and warned that there are other countries in Europe that someone in Russia could one day label as historical lands, too. Europe needs real protection from this Russian madness about history. And he's right, because if the West ever accepts the principle that Russia gets to reclaim any territory it personally considers historical, then we aren't only talking about Ukraine anymore. We're talking about ripping up the post-World War II order in Europe and replacing it with might makes right. Now look at what Putin is demanding in these negotiations, because his demands tell you everything about whether he actually wants peace. He wants Crimea recognized as Russian territory, the peninsula Russia illegally annexed in 2014. He wants Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson recognized as Russian territory as well, even though Russian forces do not fully control all of those regions. In other words, Russia is demanding land it hasn't even managed to capture. Let that sink in. Putin is demanding that Ukraine pull its own troops out of Ukrainian territory Russia never successfully conquered, and simply hand it over to Moscow. It's like a bank robber insisting you give him not only what he stole, but also the cash in the vault he couldn't reach. And it doesn't end there. Putin also demands that Ukraine permanently abandon its bid to join NATO. He wants guarantees that no Western troops will ever be deployed to Ukraine. And he has openly warned that any NATO personnel on Ukrainian soil would be treated as legitimate targets for Russian strikes. So Putin's end state is clear. Ukraine dismembered, defenseless, unable to seek protection, and forced to accept this arrangement as internationally recognized, and locked into a peace agreement that makes it nearly impossible to reverse the seizures later. That isn't a peace proposal. That's a conquest plan, with a stamp of international approval. And here's what the past 2 months have revealed about Putin's real intentions. In late November, a draft 28-point peace plan emerged from talks involving American and Russian officials, reportedly shaped largely between Trump's team and Putin's inner circle. When details leaked, Ukrainian and European officials were horrified. The plan reportedly baked in major territorial concessions to Russia, used vague language on security guarantees for Ukraine, and included ideas that would leave Ukraine exposed to a future Russian strike. Ukraine and its European partners pushed back immediately, and the document was reportedly cut down to 19 points as Kiev and European capitals scrambled to strip out the worst concessions. Then, on December 2nd and 3rd, Witkoff and Kushner flew to Moscow and held a marathon 5-hour meeting with Putin. Russian officials described the talks as useful, constructive, and highly informative. But notice what they did not call it: successful. There was no breakthrough, no compromise, no sign Putin had moved even a centimeter from his maximalist goals. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, told reporters there was more work to be done, which is diplomatic language for "we got nowhere." Around the same time, Putin spoke to Indian media and made the reason for the stalemate unmistakable. He said Russia cannot accept several key points in the American proposals, and when asked what victory looks like for Russia, he replied that Russia will finish when it achieves the goals set at the beginning of the special military operation, when it frees these territories. Again, not when we reach a settlement, not when we compromise, but when Russia gets what it set out to take in February 2022, by force or by coercion. This is a man whose war aims haven't budged in nearly 4 years of grinding conflict. Then came the diplomatic flurry in mid-December. Zelensky met U.S. envoys in Berlin on December 16th and described the evolving proposal as not perfect, but workable. He said Ukraine was close to agreement on security guarantees, while emphasizing that territorial control remained unresolved. The very next day, Putin delivered his defense ministry speech and made clear Russia's territorial demands are non-negotiable, and that Moscow is ready to escalate militarily if diplomacy doesn't deliver what it wants. European officials watching this have grown increasingly alarmed. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas put it bluntly: Russia does not want peace, so Ukraine must be made as strong as possible. Britain's new MI6 chief, Blaise Maitrewelli, went further, warning that Putin is dragging out negotiations while remaining determined to subjugate Ukraine and harass NATO members. And they're right, because if you watch what Russia does during these peace talks, not what Putin says, the pattern is unmistakable. During the same week, American envoys were in Moscow discussing peace. Russian forces unleashed large-scale drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. On December 4th, Russia launched 138 drones at Ukraine in a single night. On December 10th, a Russian strike killed 11 civilians at a medical facility in Zaporizhia. Throughout these so-called negotiations, Russian artillery kept pounding Ukrainian positions, Russian missiles kept hitting civilian infrastructure, and Russian forces kept grinding forward in the Donbass. That is not what serious peace-seeking looks like. That is what it looks like when negotiations become another front in the war, another way to pressure, exhaust, and extract concessions while the fighting continues. So why won't Putin cut a deal? Why the drawn-out talks that lead nowhere? The answer is simple and deeply cynical. Putin believes he's winning, and he sees no reason to compromise when he thinks time is working for him. Look at Putin's calculus. First, he looks at the battlefield and sees slow, painful, expensive Russian gains. Yes, Ukraine still holds territory in Russia's Kursk region, which is humiliating for Moscow. Yes, Ukrainian drones keep striking deeper into Russian territory, hitting oil refineries and military facilities. Yes, Russian losses are catastrophic, with Western estimates placing killed and wounded in 2025 alone at over 400,000. But from Putin's perspective, Russia is still inching forward in eastern Ukraine, and, according to the Institute for the Study of War, at current rates of advance, Russia wouldn't fully capture the Donetsk region until around August 2027, snail-paced progress bought with rivers of Russian blood. But it is still progress in his mind, and as long as the line creeps forward, he believes he has no incentive to settle for less than everything. Second, Putin looks at Western politics and sees opportunity. Donald Trump won the presidency after promising he could end the war in 24 hours. Trump has repeatedly suggested Ukraine should make territorial concessions to secure peace, and his administration has pressed Kyiv to come to the table. European unity, stronger than Putin expected, shows strain as the war drags into its fourth year. Some leaders are war-weary. Publics are frustrated by rising defense costs and energy prices. The debate grows louder. How long can support continue at this level? Putin sees all of that and decides the West will crack first. Trump will get impatient and pressure Ukraine into a bad deal, and European governments will start prioritizing their own economic comfort over Ukrainian sovereignty. Third, Putin looks at Ukraine and sees a country under crushing strain. Ukrainian forces have fought heroically for nearly 4 years, but they're exhausted. Ammunition shortages remain a constant, even with Western aid. Manpower is stretched thin after years of mobilization. Energy infrastructure has been hammered, leaving millions without reliable power going into winter. The population is traumatized and desperate for the war to end. Putin knows it, and he's betting Ukraine's will eventually breaks if he pushes long enough. So why accept a compromised peace today? In his mind, when a few more months of grinding pressure might hand him everything. Fourth, and this is crucial, Putin looks inward and sees he has no off-ramp at home. He has spent 4 years telling Russians this war is an existential struggle against NATO aggression, that Ukraine is run by Nazis backed by the West, that Russia is fighting for survival and historical destiny. He has framed compromise as betrayal. He has sidelined or purged anyone who hinted the war might have been a mistake. He has built his legitimacy on the story that Russia is winning and will emerge stronger and safer. So if he signs a deal that leaves Ukraine independent, armed, and aligned with the West, how does he sell that? How does he justify the bloodshed? How does he explain hundreds of billions of rubles spent and vast casualties, only to end with less than his original goals? Putin has trapped himself in a corner where anything short of total victory looks like defeat, and autocrats who look defeated don't tend to remain in power for long. That's why Putin's strategic silence isn't silence at all. It's calculated intransigence, dressed up as negotiation. He shows up to meetings. He uses the word peace. He makes just enough conciliatory noises to keep channels open and to give Trump something he can point to as progress. But Putin never shifts his core demands. He never offers meaningful concessions. He never recognizes Ukrainian sovereignty or the legitimacy of Ukraine's resistance. He stalls, drags things out, uses diplomacy as cover while his military keeps pushing and bets that eventually someone on the other side will blink. Now here's the part Putin doesn't want you to believe. For all its cold logic, this strategy is fundamentally flawed. Because for all the talk about strategic initiative and inevitable victory, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Yes, Russia has gained ground in 2025, but at a horrific price. Over 400,000 casualties in a single year. An average of more than 1,000 soldiers killed or wounded every day. The Russian economy, despite claims of resilience, is increasingly distorted by war spending. More than 1/3 of the federal budget now flows into defense and security. Inflation is rising. The ruble is weak. Sanctions haven't instantly collapsed the economy, but they steadily erode Russia's technological base and industrial capacity. And perhaps most revealing of all, Russia has turned to North Korea for help, bringing in thousands of North Korean troops to fight in Kursk. That is not what unstoppable victory looks like. That looks like desperation. And Ukraine, despite all its hardship, is not collapsing. Ukrainian forces still hold Russian territory in Kursk, 16 months after their stunning August 2024 offensive. Ukrainian drones keep reaching deeper into Russia with growing frequency and sophistication. Ukraine's air defenses, strengthened by Western systems, continue knocking down a significant share of missiles and drones. And crucially, Western support, while often frustratingly slow, continues. The United States has announced it is preparing a fresh round of sanctions targeting Russia's energy sector to raise the cost if Putin rejects a fair peace. European leaders, despite disagreements, remain committed to backing Ukraine. And Ukraine, under Zelensky, has made clear it won't accept a deal that leaves it defenseless and vulnerable to the next Russian attack. So here's what Putin doesn't want you to understand. His maximalist demands and his drawn-out waiting game are a losing strategy over time. Every month the war continues. Russia bleeds more soldiers, spends more money, burns more equipment, and grows more isolated. Every month, Ukraine's military becomes more experienced, more capable, better equipped with Western weapons. Every month, European defense production ramps up. Every month, Russia's demographic crisis already severe before the war gets worse as young men are killed or flee. Putin is gambling on time. But who is really running out of it? Ukraine and the West or Russia? Which brings us to the question that matters. What should the West do about Putin's so-called strategic silence? Because Putin's strategy depends on Western decision-makers misunderstanding what's happening. He needs them to believe Russia is winning. That time favors Moscow, and that the only way to end the war is to give Putin what he wants. He needs Western publics to get tired and pressure governments into a deal, any deal, just to make the war disappear. He needs Trump to chase a quick diplomatic trophy, even if it means throwing Ukraine under the bus. His plan only works if the West buys the story he's selling. But what if the West doesn't blink? What if, instead of pressuring Ukraine to accept bad terms, the U.S. and Europe dramatically increase military aid? What if, instead of treating Putin's territorial demands as the baseline for negotiations, the West makes clear Russia will gain nothing from aggression? What if democracies stop acting like this is a short crisis and prepare for the long haul, supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes? Suddenly Putin's strategy starts to look less like inevitability and more like a bluff no one has called. That's why critics are right to be alarmed by some of the proposals that have surfaced out of Trump administration negotiations with Russia. Any deal that locks in Russian territorial gains, leaves Ukraine militarily weak, and fails to provide ironclad security guarantees is not peace. It's a blueprint for the next invasion. History is brutally clear about appeasing autocrats with territorial hunger. It doesn't produce lasting peace. It produces larger demands, further aggression, and more war. Putin took Crimea in 2014, and the West sanctioned and moved on. Putin learned the cost was bearable, and that the West wouldn't fight over Ukrainian territory. So in 2022, he invaded the rest of Ukraine expecting the same pattern. If the West now resolves this war by forcing Ukraine to cede more land and accept a fragile deal, what stops Putin from returning for the rest of Ukraine in a few years, or threatening the Baltic states, or squeezing Moldova? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's why Zelensky keeps insisting any agreement must include strong security guarantees that prevent Russia from simply regrouping and attacking again. He isn't being unreasonable, he's being realistic about who Putin is and what Russia under Putin has shown it will do. And that's why European leaders keep emphasizing that Ukraine cannot be bullied into a surrender dressed up as peace. They understand a deal that rewards aggression doesn't stabilize Europe, it destabilizes it. It tells every would-be aggressor, if you fight long enough and kill enough people, the West will eventually tire and let you keep what you seized. That's not a message the democratic world can afford to send. So where does this leave us as 2025 closes and negotiations roll into the new year? It leaves us in a dangerous moment, but not a hopeless one. Putin's strategic silence is actually weakness masked as strength. He isn't quiet because he's supremely confident. He's quiet because he has no good exit strategy, and he's hoping the West hands him one through concessions he can market at home as victory. But if the West holds firm, if Ukraine continues fighting effectively, if military aid keeps flowing, and if Western unity holds, then Putin's math starts to change. Because eventually even Putin must face the reality that Russia cannot win this war militarily, cannot absorb these losses forever, and cannot remain an international pariah indefinitely. The real question is whether the West has the patience and resolve to wait Putin out. Because that's what this comes down to. Putin is betting that Western democracies with short attention spans, election cycles, and opinion polls will crack before his autocracy does. He's betting Trump will prioritize a quick diplomatic win over a just peace. He's betting Europeans will choose cheaper energy over Ukrainian sovereignty. He's betting Ukraine will eventually have no choice but to accept whatever terms Russia dictates. Those are the wagers behind his strategic silence and his maximalist demands. And whether those wagers pay off or explode in his face will shape not only Ukraine's future, but Europe's security and the international order itself. So here's the bottom line, and this is where I want to leave you. Putin's refusal to make a deal is not strength. It's a sign he's trapped inside a war of his own making, with no clean way out. His demands for more land, his threats to escalate if he doesn't get what he wants, his insistence that Russia will liberate historical lands by force if it has to. This is not the posture of a confident negotiator. It's the posture of a desperate dictator who has wagered everything on a war he can't truly win, but also can't afford to lose. And the worst thing the West could do right now is hand him the exit ramp he's begging for by pressuring Ukraine into a surrender that pretends to be a peace deal. Because that wouldn't end this war. It would set up the next one. And the next one might not stay contained within Ukraine. Putin's strategic silence is really a strategic trap for him, not for us. The only thing he needs is for the West to stay strong enough, patient enough, and principled enough to let him fall into it. Thanks for watching. Share this video. The truth about what's really happening in these negotiations matters more than ever.